By way of a very short introduction, Yevgeny is Vice President of Solution Architecture at the Hershvich Group. And he's also the founder of the Security Architecture podcast. It's designed to give back to the security community and to help security teams improve their overall architecture. And Mike Shurik is our Senior Vice President of Products at Bitglass. So Yevgeny, Mike, I'll hand the ball over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. So I think thanks for coming, Evgeny, and we'll kind of step right into things here. We can make this as interactive as you guys like, question-wise and whatnot, but we're going to step through some of the things that were actually open questions from the prior sessions. And so interestingly so, things kind of led into this, and we should have some answers for you, but feel free to ask anything at any point in time. Evgeny, why don't you kick us off here?
Great, I will. So Kevin, first of all, I'm not just a founder, I'm a co-founder of the podcast. I have a co-host as well, Dimitri, and I was very happy to have Bitglass twice on the podcast, both for the outbound browsing and ZTNA, which was our pleasure. Now, in December 2020, I presented about SASE 101, and we ended the presentation with the idea of crawl, walk, and run. There are so many different things under the SASE framework. And if you're just going to be running all the way without assessing anything, you'll be in trouble. This is why every time we're doing a step, we want to assess where we are, understand what we did, how we can adjust, and move forward. As an example, you can see the list is quite big. Michael, do you have the slides, or who's controlling the slides? Okay. You can see quite a lot of steps here. Mike, do you want to address some of them?
Yeah. I'll talk through a few of these. This is basically what we had discussed at the end of our prior session about 6 months ago. The exact same thing that you had just explained. You start out and you're not quite sure what to bite off and chew, right? Which things should you try to address first? Typically what we see, and this is a little bit of parroting maybe what you had heard last time, and we'll talk about how things have changed, but things that tend to be out of band. So things like shadow IT discovery and API integrations tend to be kind of the things you can do very, very quickly because they're not actually impacting the end users immediately, right? So as you kick up and start to walk and run and whatnot, that's where you start making active policy-based decisions to do certain things. So in a simple example from like an out-of-band API type control perspective, you might have a policy that says, if the sensitive content that's been classified as internal only or contains a bunch of PHI in a healthcare type use case or PCI in a financial services type use case gets shared externally to, let's say, a Gmail address or someone that is not on a whitelisted approved partner email. Now it's externally accessible, or maybe it's publicly accessible, that you might want to control that and pull that back in and things like that. In inline perspective, there were a lot of discussions a minute ago around things like BYOD, right? So when you have BYOD, I think that maybe if we take a step back from BYOD and call it instead non-corporate assets or non-corporate endpoints, there's a good thing to point out there. So when you're thinking about partners, right, that are working with you, you don't have control over their endpoints. So you're not going to be able to do something like install a thick client agent to control their access, but they still do need access and you need to mitigate it in some way. And so kind of what's going on here with respect to SASE and these types of security integrations tends to be a big mix that an analyst like Gartner would call multi-mode or hybrid type protection mechanisms, where you're doing things that are out of band, things like the API, discovering the shadow IT and controlling and whatnot, but then you're also doing inline controls. So from a perspective of your actual corporate devices, you might be controlling things like secure web gateway type functionality for, that example that was given a minute ago. I download something from the approved corporate licensed application, and I inadvertently, or maybe purposefully from an insider threat perspective, put that into a personal email and send it out, or put that into a personal box storage and whatnot, or accidentally drop it into the partner's SharePoint instead of your own, right? So you have to have some inline controls there. But again, because you're working with a partner, or maybe you're a doctor with multiple affiliations that works at multiple hospitals and you can't control their device, You need things too that don't require software and don't require configuration. And that's where some of this reverse proxy type aspect kicks in. So what's going on basically is that as you progress through this crawl, walk, run, and assess perspective, you're looking at really identifying the things that are of utmost risk, the devices that are entrusted, and the ones that also, given in a prior example, you may not have control over if they have antivirus installed upon. So we'll key into this in a minute from a policy recommendation perspective, but what we're mainly talking about here is generally at the high level, looking for threats and blocking their propagation, mitigating them on the fly, right? But also then looking for data exfiltration risks and sensitivity of that content. And so that ties in kind of across the board, be it a sanctioned or managed app, an internal application that might be protected by a different type of technology that we'll jump into in a minute, like ZTNA, or something that happens to be associated with personal use or partner use, which might be something that's more falling under the web in general. And so identifying the user, understanding who the user is, determining what the device is. Is it a sanctioned or unsanctioned or managed or unmanaged device? Identifying and classifying the data can all come hand in hand, regardless of if we're talking about protecting apps that are SaaS apps, IS deployed apps, or services or whatnot, or the web. And so as you continue to do this, though, you're crawling, you're walking, you're running, but you're continually looking at what's going on there and assessing them. The recommendation here being quarterly at minimum. I would say that the stuff on the slide is still applicable now. I don't know. Is there anything you would key into there? Okay.
No, it's still applicable. Not all the companies are already here. Some of them still crawling, some of them walking. I think less running, and we'll talk more about this later. And I think part of the assess part is very important. For example, with BYOD, is how to actually know your BYOD. How do I determine your BYOD? Do I do this by device control because you're part of the domain? Or do I use an MDM device to understand that you're part of this? So BYOD just by itself is a term, but you need to decide for your company what this means for you. I did an assessment for a customer a couple of weeks ago, and they told me they don't have BYOD. But when I asked them if I go to Best Buy and buy a device to connect to Office 365, what would stop me if I have 2FA? It was silent. Nothing will stop me. So it's a BYOD device. And this is part of assessing all the time and understanding if the step you did actually covered the entire scope or not.
Yeah, taking a look at that and assessing that is key. And again, integrations too become important, right? You mentioned something like MDM, right, or EMM in general, and knowing the device is maybe a Mac and managed by Jamf, or one that's managed by Intune, or one that is not, is one way of detecting that. But then even for your managed devices, it also becomes important to look at their posture. So if you do have something that's able to do that, like software running on the device, you can do things like determine that maybe the device somehow did get infected and the firewall got turned off, or the antivirus software got turned off, or whatnot. It becomes from compliant to non-compliant. Now, because of that, you might want to take an active measure and change the posture from a policy perspective, or something that we hadn't mentioned prior, looking at the behavior of the user. So maybe that device still is trusted, but you didn't have a timeout on the device or a screen lock for some reason, and someone walked up and stole the device, or you left it in a taxi and they opened it up. That's where we're talking about things like UEBA, looking for anomalous behaviors, detecting things that are atypical, and typically in those cases, generating alerts or doing things like step-up two-factor authentication to verify, you are a guinea, but let's just make sure. And we're going to do an MFA challenge there to do so accordingly. So a lot of these things kind of key into one another.
It's a very good point there, because 2 years ago, the landscape was very similar. We work from the office. Now we work from anywhere. So from where I'm coming may drastically change. Even so, I'm not supposed to be traveling a lot. And it could be an indication if I connect from New York and then I connect from Singapore and I'm not supposed to be traveling. Is this a correct behavior or not?
Exactly. Totally. So as you assess these things, what we typically see from a actual deployment and kind of tweaking perspective as you go and assess is that typically people will roll things out policy-wise with respect to kind of alerting and monitoring first, and then stepping into a more active role of, for a particular group, maybe it's just the IT organization first, I'm going to start enforcing things. So I'm showing you that, hey, we're monitoring your download here, and we've detected that you have a whole bunch of sensitive information in this document. Make sure that you protect it. And so it might not be an outright block per se to start, but at least enforcement and in-language notifications are key too. I know we have a lot of people from around the world here. You want to make sure that you're telling the user at the time of the event that they're doing something, that why that was that they were blocked, why they weren't allowed to go to the gambling site or the hacking site, or maybe they are an IT professional that's working on in the SOC team and they do have to go to some of these sites that would be classified as hacking. Be careful when you do that. So kind of reminders and coaching play a big role here too. So let's move on here, kind of the next one. You want to talk about the landscape here?
Yes, definitely. So you mentioned Gartner. It's funny enough, but 2 years ago to this date, there was no term SASE. I think it's only started in 2018 in August. And in these 2 years, the SASE framework became very, very popular. A lot of people that listen to the podcast just talk to me, ask if SASE is a niche, SASE will go away. And it's not, because if you look on the landscape and how many different markets, how many different players want to play there, it's basically humongous. I think in my mind, by the end of the year, we'll have every major network provider or vendor have some part of SASE. Maybe not all the pillars, it's quite hard to do, but at least some. And if you look on a slide, we have ZTNA vendors, we have CASB vendors, we have the security web gateway, SD-WAN, and there's traditional firewalls there as well.
Yep. I mean, one of the things that we see for sure, I would second your comment a moment ago around it's not going away. What's happening is that things are more coalescing. And to play off a bit of that last slide that Nat had presented about 45 minutes ago, it was around kind of the grouping of these things. So SD-WAN and firewall over here lives in kind of what they would call the WAN edge. Whereas if you've talked to some of the Gartner analysts, they start talking about something they call a three-legged stool, which is basically CASB plus ZTNA plus SWIG. What we've been seeing and what we've been talking about for years is the combination of these things, right? I mean, Bitglass has been offering SWIG and CASB and then ZTNA in 2021 for a number of years now. And the reason for that is because the risks are the same, right? So when someone comes to you and they say, they're no longer saying, I need a CASB. What they're saying is, I need to protect SaaS apps. I need to protect my internal apps in the same kind of way with the same kind of policies. And again, going back to the prior comment, you're protecting from threat propagation and spreading and protecting from accidental data exfiltration and leakage and whatnot. And so
you mentioned CASB and Secure Web Gateway. It's interesting because CASB by definition includes Security Web Gateway.
Basically, when someone comes to us and they say, we're worried about protecting the internet and the cloud, what we see is probably 50% of accesses are things like websites. The other 50% are things like SaaS apps on the network today. And probably of that traffic, 90 to 95% of it is all encrypted. And so if you need to look at protecting from threats and protecting from data exfiltration and whatnot, you really need to be in the path there, inspecting the traffic, doing SSL decryption, and controlling and mitigating the propagation of threats. So something that's kind of interesting that we'll talk about in a minute in a little more depth is that this year, Gartner has actually combined these things into something new. So they in the slide that showed, the Nat had showed, remember, it had those 5 bubbles of the things that are shown on the screen here. What they've done is they've combined these 3 together into something called a security service edge now. And so there is no more CASB MQ. There is no more SWIG MQ now, and there was never a ZTNA MQ. Now it's one thing called this SSE. And so as these things kind of combine, and they have been over the years, now it's being recognized by not just by the market and by the customers, but also by the analysts.
So do we separating the security component and how we deliver the traffic to the cloud?
I think we have a slide on that in a second. Let's jump into that in a moment. But yeah, those things are a little bit different and nuanced, and their approaches differ, and that's why SASE is so large.
Agree.
So this has been shown a couple times. I didn't realize that Holger and Kevin were actually going to show it as well. But not to beat a dead horse here, but basically what's going on is that working from home and hybrid work is going to require access regardless of where their user is at, right? as people adopt more SaaS technologies, web-based technologies, and whatnot, you see cloud and you see mobile as being ways that people are accessing the data. And so you need to be able to protect that data with various different technologies and platforms as users get access to it and identify the machines and whatnot and endpoints, as we were talking about a moment ago with the crawl, walk, run type approach. It's not going away though, right? So 60% of workers here are really preferring or desire flexibility. And so I'm not sure about your organization, for example, or the customers that you talk to, but what we're seeing is this kind of mix of allowing people to work and kind of free address and be in the office when they want to be, and it's not always 5 days a week. And so in general, anyways, and for I don't know 5 years plus, people have been using laptops, right, and taking their work home, and they're not on the corporate network anymore. So what do you do as people transition between these different types of approaches? I know proxies and whatnot were one of the examples in a minute, or mentioned a moment ago, but we'll drill down to that in a second. Do you have any insights on either one of the prior slides, Evgeny, that you wanted to add?
Yes. So from what I see with my customers a lot, that they're basically assessing, does everybody actually need to be in the office? And they even asking the users, do you want to be in the office? Do you need to be in the office? They realize the real estate quite expensive in some cases and not always required. Some groups figure out that they actually need to be in the office because of the communication and the roles they do. And this is why we see at least 30 to 60% of people going to have a hybrid environment. Some companies said it's going to be working from home all the time. Even so, personally, I think on the longer run, people still will require some office space to see each other.
Totally.
But I can definitely see one thing that people understand. We cannot only protect people in the office or in one location. We have to protect the people if they're home, if they're in the office, if they're flying, or if they're in Starbucks. This idea started maybe 8 years ago, but it got to the point. And as you mentioned, we all now by default have laptops. If it's 5 years ago, it was salespeople, technical people that flying all the time, lawyers. Right now, pretty much 90% of the people that working have laptops because of the pandemic.
Yep, 100%. And I think that leads into kind of this other statistic someone had mentioned but didn't actually show at the beginning. I think it might have been Nat. And so this is this PricewaterhouseCoopers here report that was run in 2020 and 2021, a survey of 5,000 global CEOs. And one thing that is significant here is the change between 2020 and 2021 being that cyber threats here went from the 4th highest to the 2nd highest in 2021. So an uptick significantly there around, how do I protect how do I protect my data? I think you're protecting end users, right, from being hacked, so you can protect your sensitive data, so that something doesn't happen that becomes a huge problem. Be it ransomware, be it theft of 9 billion passwords, be it the 700 million attacks that occurred from a account exfiltration perspective from LinkedIn in the last month and whatnot. And it's become really top of mind. And so CEOs here become more concerned, and cybersecurity is really critical to the business. If you're going to expand and do this zero trust digital transformation, you're going to start adopting some of these policies that might allow devices to not be on the network all the time, or access that's coming from devices that are non-corporate or BYO. Threats are really critical. And so focusing on ways of protecting them and minimizing the attack surface is key here. And so, identity is obviously a linchpin to this. Device detection and UEBA are obviously a key component here. Atypical behaviors and accesses from devices you don't own, and your posture on that is really critical. But a key thing here we see is that this is now top of mind in the boardroom. Are you seeing the same kind of things?
Yes, because we have very visual examples of companies brought to halt. This year and last year, multiple companies just stopped. And every time we have a ransomware in the company, people always think about, oh my God, they want so much money. But some people also need to think about, if you're not working, you're automatically losing money, a lot of money.
Yep.
And it got to the boards, people now understand if I cannot be available, and if I'm in a ransomware situation or I have a cybersecurity problem, I'm not available to my customers, I'm not available to make money, I'm losing money automatically. And I think this
100%.
is one of the main reasons why it became number two. And it is, at least I hope, will be what we call security by design, that people start thinking not how to apply security later on because of some kind of requirement, and they will adapt and do security from the beginning of the project and beginning of the work they do. Like the executive order, have ZTNA,
Yes.
have SBOM, software bill of material, EDR, all the things need to be done because they want the product to be more secure and the company be more secure, and not just to be compliant with some regulations.
Totally. Yeah, it's no longer a check the box type thing. It's really active protection that you need because it's critical to your business.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk a little bit about where we were then previously, a few years ago?
Yes, I would love to, because one of the topic of the session is to see where we are right now. And I think it's important to kind of emphasize what happened 2-3 years ago and how do we get where we are now and what do we need to focus now. So 2 years ago, majority of us work from the office. We woke up, we went to the office, we maybe travel occasionally, but our main protection was in the office. It's mean every traffic we sent to the internet went through the firewall or secure web gateway, or in some cases both. There was IPS and IDS. There was a DLP control in some cases as well to understand what you can or cannot do. So the idea was, I don't need to protect when you're traveling because you're mainly here. And in majority of the cases, when you travel, you had a VPN client that probably took majority of your traffic back to the office for inspection. This was the case. The moment pandemic started, in a matter of weeks, everything flipped. Pretty much in 2 weeks, majority of the world started working from home, and created a big gap. And the gap was probably divided between three different buckets, if you can say this. One, for big companies and financial companies. They basically told you, the moment the laptop is up, we'll force you the VPN always on, and your entire traffic will go to the data center, and we will continue to inspect it with security web gateway or firewall. And because the VPN always on, you kind of going to your office, and there's no idea of ZTNA. You have access anywhere you want. So if you have a bad actor on your laptop somehow, we'll talk about this maybe later on, emphasize how it may happen, they can get access to the environment. The other bucket was, I will do split tunneling. I will only connect to the data center, to the office when I need to. And when I connect there, I will take the traffic I need, usually by IPs, not by applications, to the office, and the rest of the traffic will go to the intranet. And in this case, majority of the time, it will be no inspection, pretty much.
Yep. That's a huge problem, right? I mean, if you're not looking at that, then you're not catching some of these digital exfiltrations that can occur, or the threats and the attacks that are occurring. You have less visibility, right?
Not just less visibility. So let's say I am forcing all the traffic to my office, but it's split tunneling. So it's actually like 2.5. So all the traffic going to the office that need to go to the office, the rest of the traffic go to the internet with or without inspection. Majority of the cases without inspection. So I can download some malware when I go to some sites, or I click on a phishing email, and later on the malware may impact and my office, and have malware in my office as well, and have issues like this. Or when I'm not connecting to the office, I'm basically browsing and do whatever I want after working hours.
Yep.
Later on, I connect back to the office, and now my traffic going to the office, and I have the same problem.
100%.
So all my great stack of IPS, URL filtering devices, firewalls, SSL inspection in the office doesn't do anything when I'm at home.
Right. So some of the pieces that, excuse me, that would be controllable here by different technologies. So from the internet browsing perspective, if it's something like a managed application, like this Google Drive example, if I'm a Google Workplace customer, that might be controlled by something like a CASB, right? Where I'm connected into that sanctioned application, be it through reverse or forward proxy or whatnot. So I'm looking at data movement, but then the API inspection controls here kind of exist to control that traffic, which is very different than, you know, going to a personal Outlook account, or you send it, or Facebook, or something else that's like a Yahoo email, right? And so I think there's a mix there of which things are protecting which capabilities and identifying which capabilities. But something else that you talked about right at the beginning was this VPN approach, right? So if you go with the VPN approach, we saw a lot of customers' VPNs just explode, for lack of a better term, because of oversaturation. And so that pushed towards a movement more towards an approach that is focused on ZTNA, which I'll talk about in a session.
So did they explode and about because the traffic going twice? I need to take the traffic to the data center for inspection and then take to get to the internet. So in a way, the traffic to the firewall, so the VPN provider or secure gateway going twice.
Yeah, and now the point being that you had probably, I don't know, somewhere between 5 maybe and 20% of the users being outside of the corporate walls, right? Outside of the office, outside of the headquarters and the branch offices. And now all of a sudden everyone's at home. So just load in general as well played into that too.
And in some companies, they didn't have, so they will have many offices, but the data center will have 2 or 3. So let's say my main data center is in New York, but I'm working in LA. The moment I work from home and my main data center is New York, it means my VPN need to go all the way to New York. Yep. And if the app I'm trying to access is still in LA in California, it means I'm not just the traffic going twice there, but my latency is becoming a problem as well.
Totally. And then you get poor user experience and whatnot.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned about digital transformation and you mentioned about API inspection. And also because there are a lot of traffic is encrypted. Certain applications, I cannot really decrypt the traffic, like Dropbox, for example, in majority of the time. So what I can do in this case, if I move from my on-prem storage to use Dropbox or OneDrive, I can use API inspection with SASEDay to understand what I can do with it, what kind of files I'm upload, are they malware, who's it shared with. It's more of a SASEDay conversation, but it's a very applicable right now because we see more and more people understand that they don't want to have shared drives. They don't want to have shared networks. They want to move stuff to the cloud and have somebody else have the headache to maintain them.
100%. Yeah, I'd agree. Some of our recommendations in general would be akin to some of these major trends. So we'll focus on these for the rest of the presentation in individual sections. This data protection and cyber threats are obviously of utmost importance, with ransomware just being one of the examples. But you know, protecting your data is really your IP and your crown jewels, right? And they can again be exfiltrated inadvertently with mistakes by actual users that are trusted users, or they could be exfiltrated by means of threats, right? Or
Mike, I want to interrupt you for a second here because you mentioned crown jewels. So in my practice, I see multiple times when we ask customers, what's your crown jewels? We have a blank stare.
Yeah.
Is this part of a SaaS? Is this part of actually starting my SASE journey and my data protection journey to understand what they're actually protecting?
I think so. If you don't know what that happens a lot of times, I would say in verticals that aren't as highly regulated. A lot of times in financial services and in healthcare, you have GRC organizations that are about governance, risk, and compliance that are trying to do things like classify and tag the data and identify the data, and they know what is sensitive and what is, you know, customer facing and what is not and what needs to be protected. That's not so much true when you go to the people that have, and even in organizations that are highly regulated, sometimes they don't know how to do that, right? And so it's a combination of things like, actually, there's different approaches to it too. Sometimes you try to push that burden to the end user, and you say, "Hey, user, you need to go classify this data. You tell me if it's confidential or it's internal only, and whatnot." And that can be a losing battle there too, because the user might not know as well. Like when you get those blank stares from the board, what do you think the user is going to do? They're not going to know either. So you need some mechanisms that are able to break that up and kind of take a taxonomy of that data, of the sensitivity of it, and typically that plays into, I mean, general things like this SharePoint site and the documents inside of it are owned by finance, so they tend to be more sensitive, obviously, or HR is more sensitive than maybe something else. Now, for a different reason, something like DevOps and code might be sensitive because it's more IP related. But then general users that are doing things like sales and doing things like marketing and whatnot, where does that play? And so that's where these gray areas kind of come in, and it becomes difficult. And we see that too. We do see some of these blank stares and whatnot. And so we kind of have to guide people and walk them through, this is how you need to start thinking about this. And DLP isn't the only answer, because sometimes it can be really burdensome and hard to.
So if we're going back to the analogy of a ship and a hull, I need to prioritize my crown jewels, because if I cannot expect, I don't want my entire ship to have water. I need to expect that part of the ship may leak.
Yep.
Unfortunately, but there is some part that if they leak, the entire ship will go down. Like maybe the motor location. Yep. And this is going to be my crown jewels. Same as the company. You mentioned sales. You mentioned finance. Sales are important, but if you lose a sales laptop or you lose a financial person laptop, what's more important for the company? Different companies may have different things.
100%. And there's kind of one of the dichotomies that exist too between different types of verticals too comes to light in healthcare, because sometimes or really engineering driven organizations as well, similarly, but completely different vertical, where the people in these really DevOps driven type software companies typically have a lot of control and push per se. So they push back a lot on IT, and they push back a lot on security. The same is true for doctors, like the CMO, the chief medical officer, not marketing officer, but medical officer at a hospital. If you do something to them that's really, cumbersome and causes them to not be able to save patients, they're obviously going to push back. And that's where this kind of balance comes in. And so I've heard organizations pitch, like RBI vendors, for example, pitch, hey, all of your board members or all of your high-level executives, push all their traffic through RBI. That's never going to fly. That's a
RBI, you mean browser isolation, correct?
Yeah, through isolation, right? You need to be really thinking about the balance between, I obviously have to protect my data and I have to protect myself from threats, but you can't impede the business from working, because that's really the key to digital transformation and growth. And that's kind of where the zero trust aspect comes in, and kind of, thinning down that attack surface so that you can get the utmost security that is possible, but also enable people to do work without clamping down and locking them out from their daily lives. So, that plays into a bit of this remote work too. It's not going away. And so remember that as people move and are at different locations, how do we protect them and whatnot, and what key things play into this? I've mentioned this before, but the analysts are also seeing this. We're seeing this combination here of this CASB SWIG and CTNA officially this year. So now you'll see this new Magic Quadrant coming out. But let's drill down into a little of the data protection aspects. I think we've probably mentioned this a few times, but proliferation of threats is really key. Thinking about where those can occur, though, is also important, right? It can be websites, it can be SaaS apps. The SaaS apps can be applications that are not corporate owned or might be owned by someone other than you, like a partner, for example, like we mentioned a couple times, or you have IaaS type deployments where someone is doing development, right? Or PaaS even, where they're developing code on top of something else, and they have sensitive data in it by means of that application. And so, how do you protect the data inside of that infrastructure? And it might be a custom app that's developed for internal use in an IaaS platform like AWS or Azure or GCP or something like that. It might be an internal application that's on your own data center or whatnot. So you really need to assess all these different types of places where the data can exist, assess how sensitive it is, and try to minimize the attack surface perpetually. So it's not like a one-time thing that you assess your data and you get the taxonomy and you're good to go. This is happening over and over again. Again, going back to that crawl, walk, run analogy, something that is on a quarterly basis seems probably feasible. And then the same thing can happen from an exfiltration perspective, right? That can happen through SaaS, that can happen through web, that could happen through internal applications or IaaS. And so, and again, it can be accidental or purposeful. So looking at the way that people are accessing the data, the different types of things that are allowed, identifying how to assess and enforce the policies can be complex. And again, that becomes even more complex with non-corporate devices or BYD.
Agree.
So why don't you talk a little bit about this?
So we are currently, what, year and a half where we're working from home. So what happened right now and what people are doing right now? So let's divide it between three different things. In theory, ideally, where we would like it to be is you only sending the traffic to the corporate offices, to the data center over ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Access, not by IPs, by applications. It means that if you need to access your on-prem HR application or your CRM or anything else, it's only going to these applications from people. So the amount of traffic that going to the data center, it's quite small. Also, you only have access to these applications. You are not supposed to browse and map and scan the entire network from home. And this should apply for corporate employees and for the third-party contractors that potentially need to come and do some work, fix your AC, or do development for you as well. Yep. This is one part. Now, we have the rest of the chunk that's going direct to the internet. This part, ideally, should be secure by secure web gateway, firewall as a service with IPS, IDS, and type of CASB to understand what's actually happening. Because one, we want to ensure that corporate policy is actually done. I mean by this, if the corporate policy says you are not allowed to browse to hacking sites or gambling sites, it will be protected. Second, we of course don't want your end device to have malware or you have malware be downloaded to your device. So this is the second part of it. We want to scan the files. And for the uploads, we also want to inspect for multiple things as well. We'll talk about this a bit later. Now, there's another category of traffic that we probably don't need to scan. Why do we say probably? Because there's some requests of people to do it, but it's not always possible. For example, Office 365 traffic is encrypted. We cannot get inside it. We can use API to scan it in a different way. Zoom traffic cannot be scanned as well, and in many cases, no need to be scanned. So this is the third pillar of traffic we deliberately don't want to scan, and we bypass it. And ideally, we want companies to be here. Not all the companies are there. Many companies thinking about how to get there, but they're not fully there yet. Now, we still have the idea of API-based inspection on a backend where we can come in to OneDrive and right now to AWS, scan S3 buckets, scan what do you do and what do you upload. In majority of the cases, we scan for multiple things. One, who do you share this document with? What kind of document it is, if it's infected by any chance. And very, very important, thank you, Michael, is DLP. We don't want the information to be leaking. If I upload a file with all my customers' information for myself, and I share this with Mike, first of all, should I share it with Mike? Did I only share it with Mike or I share it with everyone else? It's also a violation. Unfortunately, we saw so many S3 buckets in AWS that got leaked because of inappropriate configuration of the configuration of the buckets. This is also part of what we call CSPM, Cloud Secure Posture Management, very, very popular field, an important field to secure AWS, Google, and Azure as well.
100%. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we've talked about, and we do have a slide in a second that shows all kinds of other things that are important from identification of what the data is and how sensitive it is, or what the configuration is and whatnot. There's also one that's actually not listed on here that's SSPM, or SaaS Security Posture Management. You know, if you're looking at CSPM with respect to IaaS platforms and you're going to monitor and make sure that, you know, there are very few global administrators that have access to all of AWS, for example, and that we're using role-based access control and the principle of least privilege, why wouldn't you do the same thing for a box, right? Why wouldn't you do the same thing for your SaaS apps? So from a SSPM perspective, it's the same kind of integration with CSPM where you're looking at APIs and you're saying, is this something like the example of the bucket shared publicly? Is there an ability to, in an Office 365 example, allow external people to jump into your Teams meetings? Maybe, maybe not. And so what we see there a lot of times, especially in regulated verticals, is a mix between, if I'm using O365, maybe that's my internal sharing only, and I restrict that to internal use, but then I have an external share that's maybe Box that I use for file back and forth. And so when you do something like that, you're kind of saying, this silo of location of data is for internal use only. This other thing is for external use and only certain people have access to it. And then also identifying that if I'm supposed to be doing external sharing with Box, and then I'm working with a partner and they happen to use Dropbox, they happen to use a different Office 365 SharePoint location for their repo, that I still share through Box to share to them. I don't start putting things into their repository as well. So this differentiation, instance awareness, or tenancy controls become really critical there too, because you want to be able to detect and determine that this is a personal thing versus something that's partner related versus something that is internal and corporately owned, and is the place where different types of data can be housed. And again, accidentally putting them in the wrong place can definitely occur. So kicking in and kind of combining these things together is really critical to, again, reduce the attack surface and identify the data so that it can be protected in a way that's really fastidious and a way that's applicable, but still enables business to do what they need to do and bring in money and stay afloat.
So Michael, I know we have a couple of slides left, but I want to dive to one part that I think is very important. So we circle 4 different technologies here. Inline technology, like secure web gateway firewall.
Yep.
That basically inspect outbound traffic. ZTNA, that provide us the availability to connect back to the data centers. But also, we want to inspect traffic leaving the company. So if we put this great presentation somewhere in the data center on the cloud, if I have 4 different vendors, I probably will have to have 4 different DLP configuration to not allow this presentation to leave.
Right.
And Kevin mentioned this before when I talk about BYOD. With kind of one DLP platform to maintain this, make my life easier to say, I want such files not to leave my company, and I don't care where they are. Cloud, SaaS, IaaS, inline, outbound.
Yes, you want that. The problem with doing that with multiple different vendors is that typically the integrations for DLP specifically tend to be things like ICAP integrations. And
that will not work well.
Yeah, that doesn't work. That doesn't work for inline for sure. You can do that with API where you send something across and you have an amount of time that you get to process something and make a decision. But in an upload or download scenario, it has to happen immediately. So what we see there is either importing rules from something else or synchronizing rules from something else, or coalescing to a data protection platform that can do all these things for you in one place. Right. So maybe one vendor does provide you with the SWIG and the CASB and the ZTNA that ties into their DLP. And in a scenario where you might want to push an incident management or EDR type workflow back to some product you may have already invested in, like a Vontu or whatnot, you may still want to push things out and send them to ICAP just so they can go through the whole workflows and things like that. But what you need here is something that can provide all these types of solutions, regardless of the access is to a ZTNA type application in a corporate data center. And one thing to point out, which I'll cover in 45 minutes with respect to ZTNA, is that almost all the solutions on the market don't actually inspect the traffic. They're more of access control. Can I allow access to this resource or to this application or not? And so with an approach like that, you're not getting any visibility into what's going on. So what you really want to do is cracking open that SSL, looking at what's going on there, identifying the data, be it a threat that you're going to block or data that you're going to block from exfiltration. But point being, like you're pointing out, it's not just ZTNA, it's not just SWIG, it's not just CASB. You want them all combined, and you want that DLP solution to be centric around all of them. And with scalability and robustness too, for doing things that are more advanced. Sometimes you might want to file fingerprint something or do exact data matching, and not all vendors can do that. And so really thinking about how you progress down this crawl, walk, run approach, be it with one vendor or multiple vendors, is really important, because tying things together and making sure that protection mechanism exists across any type of access, be it that internal app or that website or that SaaS app or that partners app, is really critical. Otherwise, you have holes, right? You have a leaky ship. So let me advance here, because we're getting close to the end here, about 10 minutes left. What about this, Evgeny? What about this SD-WAN versus client approach? What are your thoughts?
So we mentioned multiple times for the last hour and before us as well, that we can work from home or can work from the office. From my perspective, when you work from home, the realistic and the easiest things to do, you have an agent on your device to route the traffic to the SASE provider to the cloud. In some very small cases, when you're a financial company or you really need this SD-WAN because you want to also have your VoIP phone, for example, connected, you may use a small SD-WAN box at home. In the offices, it's quite differently, because it's much easier for me going to be to have an SD-WAN box in the office, create most likely 2 tunnels to different cloud POPs, and make sure my traffic is routed to the correct location and have automatic failover. And also in some cases, I don't have the ability to install the agent on certain servers or certain network devices. So the SD-WAN options is there. In my mind, it's much more valuable there as well. Now, I think it's also very important that the SASE providers that are playing in security space will play well with the SASE providers that play in SD-WAN space. For example, if you're a company that has 200 offices and you're going to plan to deploy 200 SD-WAN appliances, do you really want to go manually and configure all of them? Or do you want to have an API connectivity, a way to provision the configuration? And when you plug the box and SD-WAN, it goes to the cloud, to the mothership, download the configuration, automatically create the tunnels, and you're up and running. It's going to save you a lot of time on deployment, and also you're going to be running much faster.
Yeah, I think something really interesting there to think about too is, I have this device, I'm protecting it here, and maybe it is the hybrid work scenario. It's off the network, it's at your house or a Starbucks or an airport, and you're going to block the threats and whatnot, and you're going to block the exfiltration of data. But then what happens when they go back on the network? And so a lot of times people will do detection where it turns off the protections that are applied on the agent when you're on the network, because I might already have an investment in a stack of boxes in my data center that's doing DLP, IPS, IDS, URL filtering, and things like that. This SD-WAN approach also has some vendors saying, hey, while we're more networking focused and came from an SD-WAN or firewall as a service type approach, we're going to add some lightweight CASB features, or we're going to add some lightweight secure gateway type features into our platform. And even if those things were strong and powerful and rich, which they really aren't today, but if they were, again, you have that same thing that we were talking about that on the last slide, the dichotomy of now I have another set of policies that I have to manage, right? That's different than the ones I was enforcing with another solution, be it Bitglass or something else, right? So what we're seeing a lot of times here is a desire to use SD-WAN as the overlay, so that when I'm in a remote user, or I'm on a mobile client, or I'm in a remote office, I can get access to the data center, which might be in the headquarters, right? Instead of using MPLS, right? We're going to use SD-WAN overlay for something like that. But when I do go to the internet, now I want those same set of policies. So if you can tie in to one of these SASE or SOC providers and route the traffic from SD-WAN up into that same cloud fabric, right? That same cloud fabric that was protecting the user when they were off the network over here, when they were accessing from a BYO device through the reverse proxy, then that's more centralized visibility, a single pane of glass, a place of control, and your policies then are the same too. So what Bitglass has done in particular, since we're running on top of AWS, we have integrations with, I think it's 13 or 14 different vendors kind of out of the box for SD-WAN because of the transit gateway that we've integrated with here. So what you can do is do that overlay, do that cost savings with respect to MPLS in particular, and forward the traffic up to the cloud platform that's located all over the world, so that you have this consistent security posture and consistent DLP, like you were talking about in the last slide, regardless of where the user is. So you get the same enforcement here as you get on the network, regardless of if the agent is on or off, depending on your policies. So kind of interesting mix there of how to approach the problem in different ways to provide consistent security regardless of where the user's at. So let's get here to this last slide, kind of throwing it back a little bit to Nat's discussion at the beginning. One thing that I guess wasn't really pointed out here, but Evgeny alluded to and mentioned was, you have your most sensitive things, your crown jewels and you need to identify what those are. Most notably, the engine and the boiler rooms here happen to be in the center of the ship, right?
Yeah, but again, this is for each customer. The engine and the boiler will be different.
Totally, 100%. But you want to protect that with kind of layers of security, and there's a lot of different ways to do so. And so we have a mix of different technologies here. We mentioned UEBA and ZTNA and SSPM and CSPM and things like that, EDR. Assessing the risk of a user is something that I guess wasn't brought up so far. Determining that one day Mike does something that's atypical, and so maybe his score goes from a 5 to a 15, and that may enforce a different type of policy. We may now inspect what he's doing more in depth, or maybe it's atypical, and what we want to do is make sure it's him. So the next time he tries to download some sensitive piece of document, we're going to require justification for that, or we're going to remind him that he needs to protect that data. And that kind of plays a little bit into the GRC examples you were giving before, where you're identifying the data, you're making sure that you maintain compliance, you're telling the user about things as they happen, so that they don't inadvertently or mistakenly do something. I mean, you see that too in things like phishing type blocks. Someone clicks a link, we determine it to be a malware dropper or to be a phishing type site. And we're not just going to outright block it. We're going to show them a message and say, hey, you did something bad here, you did something wrong, and this is why we did this to you, to avoid pushing all these incidents into the stock and kind of training users to minimize that. And so all these things play together here to protect the data. And you need multiple different types of protections. One thing that's key, though, is that while vendors may provide some sort of capabilities, you want really a third-party platform to do this. So the fox guarding the henhouse analogy there, sometimes people say, is Microsoft good enough? Sometimes, but not all the time. And then when you have more SaaS apps than just Office 365 is where things start to fall apart. So, thinking about how you're going to protect this and how you're going to provide and combine the different solutions that you may have already bought or you're thinking about buying is really critical. But take all these different things into account, because without that, you don't really know what's going on with your data or your threats, and that's obviously critical and key.
One part that I think is important to mention as well, and I think ship is a good analogy. If I have a hole in one of the compartment, it doesn't mean that's it. This compartment is gone, and I spent 5 years in the Navy, so I can tell you how it's working. You actually want to go and block it. So this is where we come. The SIM part, how fast I can know I have a problem. And then you want remediation, orchestration. Do I go and manually block it? Do I have devices? Can I do a SOAR integration? Can I have multiple people doing this? In our case, it's going to be, can I remove this endpoint from the network? Can I remove or from home, or block the connections, or do something else? So the remediation part on containment of a problem, of course, understanding there's a problem and containment of the problem is also key.
Agreed. So we're running on the end of time here. So let me throw out some questions. So do you have any idea to implement SASE in the case of a partial move of a workload to the cloud? It seems benefit of full SASE requires move of all workloads to the public cloud only. In the case of workloads running on-premise, VPN solutions will be cost effective than a full SASE model. So kind of a question about, how do you think about costs, and how do you think about where the data is located?
I can try to answer this one first. I think there's two things here. As we mentioned, if all my workloads stay in a data center, then I take the part that calls ZTNA and connect it back to the data center. Right. Now, As we mentioned, one of the problems with VPN in majority of the cases is the moment I'm in, I have access to anywhere I want. And I think as a group, we all agree that we don't want to have access. We want only to have provide access to where you need. So this is one part.
Yep.
Now, is it means that you need to do much more? No, you just change the way you do this to connect back to the data center. But the other part of it is I still need to browse the internet. I still need to go to Facebook's or to HR sites or whatever people do, marketing sites, do my work. How do you protect this? This is the part of SASE, of secure web gateway and firewall as a service comes in to make sure you're protecting the data of what people downloading. And also you want to maintain the policy of the company or what you can or cannot do as part of the work.
100%. One other thing that kind of is similar to that was how do you address privacy data from all the data flowing through the network, unstructured metadata, structured data, et cetera? And so maybe I'll talk about that for a second. There are lots of different types of data, right? It can be in the unstructured type of example, for example, a ServiceNow ticket that someone creates. They freeform type in text to the description field, and it may or may not contain sensitive information. A lot of times it does, though, with these tickets. You're saying, hey, my machine is this machine, and I'm trying to do this, and I'm getting blocked from uploading this file. Here's the file. Right. And so that's a mix there of the description being unstructured data, the attachment being structured data. It may be having some metadata classification inside of that file to say, you know, internal only or whatnot. And you know, maybe you're paying some managed service provider that's outside to manage these tickets. And all of a sudden now they have a view of that sensitive data, right, in that attachment that they weren't supposed to attach it in the first place. So you need something that can do all those things, and sometimes that involves things like encryption of data being both structured or unstructured. Sometimes that involves just DLP being applied on things like blobs or JSONs that are posted and whatnot. Other times it involves file inspection and things like that. But again, going back to in that MSSP type example I gave a second ago, you know, showing the user, hey, you know, you shouldn't have done this. We're gonna block you from doing so on purpose is really key there. But taxonomy of the data is really critical. Identifying that, you know, this contains a medical record number in some particular case versus this contains a code that has tokens that aren't supposed to be shared externally, and someone uploads it to a GitHub repo on the internet, trying to, you know, share something and help someone else out. You know, you want to be able to identify all those different types of things, and that's really key. You have anything to add to that?
No, I think you hit it the nail on the head, and I think we're running out of time. I see Kevin here popping up.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Evgeny. Thanks, Mike. That was a great discussion, and I have a suspicion that's going to be a continuing discussion that we'll have for some time. So thanks again, guys.